Chapter 2 Constitution 2.1 The Modern Constitution. Modernity is often defined in terms of humanism, either as a way of saluting the birth of man or as a way of announcing his death. But this habit itself is modern because it remains asymmetrical. It overlooks the simultaneous birth of non-humanity, things or objects or beasts, and the equally strange beginning of a crossed-out God relegated to the sidelines. Modernity arises first from the conjoined creation of those three entities, and then from the masking of the conjoined birth and the separate treatment of the three communities, while, underneath, hybrids continue to multiply as an effect of this separate treatment. The double separation is what we have to reconstruct. The separation between humans and non-humans on the one hand, and between what happens above and what happens below on the other. These separations could be compared to the division that distinguishes the judiciary from the executive branch of a government. This division is powerless to account for the multiple links, the intersecting influences, the continual negotiations between judges and politicians. Yet it would be a mistake to deny the effectiveness of the separation. The modern divide between the natural world and the social world has the same constitutional character, with one difference. Up to now, no one has taken on the task of studying scientists and politicians in tandem, since no central vantage point has seemed to exist. In one sense, the fundamental articles of faith pertaining to the double separation have been so well drawn up that this separation has been viewed as a double ontological distinction. As soon as one outlines the symmetrical space and thereby re-establishes the common understanding that organizes the separation of natural and political powers, one ceases to be modern. The common text that defines this understanding and this separation is called a constitution, as when we talk about amendments to the American Constitution. Who is drafting such a text? For political constitutions, the task falls to jurists and founding fathers, but so far they have done only a third of the work, since they have left out both scientific power and the work of hybrids. For the nature of things, it is the scientists' task, but they have done only another third of the work, since they have pretended to forget about political power, and they have denied that hybrids have any role to play, even as they multiply them. For the work of translation, writing the Constitution is the task of those who study those strange networks that I have outlined above, but science students have fulfilled only half of their contract, since they do not explain the work of purification that is carried out above them and accounts for the proliferation of hybrids. Who is to write the full Constitution? As far as foreign collectives are concerned, anthropology has been pretty good at tackling everything at once. In fact, as we have seen, every ethnologist is capable of including within a single monograph the definition of the forces in play, the distribution of powers among human beings, gods, and non-humans, the procedures for reaching agreements, the connections between religion and power, ancestors, cosmology, property rights, plant and animal taxonomies. The ethnologist will certainly not write 3 separate books, one dealing with knowledge, another with power, yet another with practices. She will write a single book, like the magnificent one in which Philippe Descola attempts to sum up the constitution of the Achuar of the Amazon region. Yet the Achuar have not completely subdued nature by the symbolic networks of domesticity. Granted, the cultural sphere is all-encompassing, since in it we find animals, plants, and spirits which other Amerindian societies place in the realm of nature. The Achuar do not therefore share this antinomy between two closed and irremediably opposed worlds, the cultural world of human society and the natural world of animal society. And yet there is, nevertheless, a certain point at which the continuum of sociability breaks down, yielding to a wild world inexorably foreign to humans. Incomparably smaller than the realm of culture, this little piece of nature includes the set of things with which communication cannot be established. Opposite beings endowed with language, of which humans are the most perfect incarnation. Stand those things deprived of speech that inhabit parallel, inaccessible worlds. The inability to communicate is often ascribed to a lack of soul, wakan, that affects certain living species. Most insects and fish, poultry, and numerous plants which thus lead a mechanical, inconsequential existence. But the absence of communication is sometimes due to distance. The souls of stars and meteors, infinitely far away and prodigiously mobile, remain deaf to human words. If an anthropology of the modern world were to exist, its task would consist in describing in the same way how all the branches of our government are organized, including that of nature and the hard sciences, and in explaining how and why these branches diverge, as well as accounting for the multiple arrangements that bring them together. The ethnologist of our world must take up her position at the common locus where roles, actions, and abilities are distributed, those that make it possible to define one entity as animal or material and another as a free agent, one as endowed with consciousness, another as mechanical, and still another as unconscious and incompetent. Our ethnologist must even compare the always different ways of defining, or not defining, matter, law, consciousness, and animals' souls without using modern metaphysics as a vantage point. Just as the constitution of jurists defines the rights and duties of citizens and the state, the working of justice and the transfer of power, so this constitution, which I shall spell with a capital C to distinguish it from the political ones, defines humans and non-humans, their properties and their relations, their abilities and their groupings. How can this constitution be described? I have chosen to concentrate on an exemplary situation that arose at the very beginning of its drafting, in the middle of the 17th century, when the natural philosopher Robert Boyle and the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes were arguing over the distribution of scientific and political power. Such a choice might appear arbitrary if a remarkable book had not just come to grips with this double creation of a social context and a nature that escapes that very context. I shall use Boyle and Hobbes, along with their descendants and disciples, as a way of summarizing a much longer story, one that I cannot retrace here, but one that others, better equipped than I, may want to pursue. 2.2 Boyle and His Objects. A book by Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaffer marks the real beginning of a comparative anthropology that takes science seriously. At first glance, this book does nothing more than exemplify what has been the slogan of the Edinburgh School of Science Studies, and of a great body of work in the social history of science, and in the sociology of knowledge. Questions of epistemology are also questions of social order. It is impossible to do justice to either question if the two are separated, one assigned to departments of philosophy and the other to departments of sociology or political science. But Shapin and Schaffer pushed this general program to the limit, first by displacing the historical beginning of this very divide between epistemology and sociology, and second, in part unwittingly, by ruining the privilege given to the social context in explaining the sciences. We have not referred to politics as something that happens solely outside of science, and which can, so to speak, press in upon it. The experimental community, set up by Boyle, vigorously developed and deployed such boundary speech, and we have sought to situate this speech historically and to explain why these conventionalized ways of talking developed. What we cannot do, if we want to be serious about the historical nature of our inquiry, is to use such act as speech unthinkingly as an explanatory resource. The language that transports politics outside of science is precisely what we need to understand and explain. We find ourselves standing against much current sentiment in the history of science that holds that we should have less talk of the insides and outsides of science, that we have transcended such outmoded categories. Far from it. We have not yet begun to understand the issues involved. We still need to understand how such boundary conventions developed, how, as a matter of historical record, scientific actors allocated items with respect to their boundaries, not ours, and how, as a matter of record, they behaved with respect to the items thus allocated. Nor should we take any one system of boundaries as belonging self-evidently to the thing that is called science. Shapin and Schaffer, 1985. In this long passage, the authors do not show how the social context of England might justify the development of Boyle's physics and the failure of Hobbes's mathematical theories. They come to grips with the very basis of political philosophy. Far from situating Boyle's scientific works in their social context, or showing how politics presses in upon scientific doctrines, they examine how Boyle and Hobbes fought to invent a science, a context, and a demarcation between the two. They are not prepared to explain the content by the context, since neither existed in this new way before Boyle and Hobbes reached their respective goals and settled their differences. The beauty of Shapin and Schaffer's book stems from their success in unearthing Hobbes's scientific works, which had been neglected by political scientists because they were embarrassed by the wild mathematical imaginings of their hero, and in rescuing from oblivion Boyle's political theories, which had been neglected by historians of science because they preferred to conceal their hero's organizational efforts. Instead of setting up an asymmetry, instead of distributing science to Boyle and political theory to Hobbes, Shapin and Schaffer outline a rather nice quadrant. Boyle has a science and a political theory. Hobbes has a political theory and a science. The quadrant would be uninteresting if the ideas of our two heroes were too far apart. If, for example, one were a philosopher after the fashion of Paracelsus, and the other a Baudin-style lawmaker. But by good fortune, they agree on almost everything. They want a king, a parliament, a docile and unified church, and they are fervent subscribers to mechanistic philosophy. But even though both are thoroughgoing rationalists, their opinions diverge as to what can be expected from experimentation, from scientific reasoning, from political argument, and above all from the air pump, the real hero of the story. The disagreements between the two men, who agree on everything else, make them the ideal laboratory material, the perfect fruit flies for the new anthropology. Boyle carefully refrained from talking about vacuum pumps. To put some order into the debates that followed the discovery of the Torricellian space at the top of a mercury tube inverted in a basin of the same substance, he claimed to be investigating only the weight of the air, without taking sides in the dispute between planists and vacuists. The apparatus he developed, modelled on Otto von Guericke's, that would permanently evacuate the air from a transparent glass container, was, for the period, in terms of cost, complication, and novelty, the equivalent of a major piece of equipment in contemporary physics. This was already big science. The great advantage of Boyle's installations was that they made it possible to see inside the glass walls and to introduce or even manipulate samples, owing to a series of ingeniously constructed lock chambers and covers. The pistons of the pump, the thick glass containers, and the gaskets were not of adequate quality, so Boyle had to push technological research far enough, for instance, to be able to carry out the experiment he cared most about, that of the vacuum within a vacuum. He enclosed a Torricelli tube within the pump's glass enclosure, and thus obtained an initial space at the top of the overturned tube. Then, by getting one of his technicians, who were invisible, to work the pump, he suppressed the weight of the air enough to bring down the level of the column, which descended nearly to the level of the mercury in the basin. Boyle undertook dozens of experiments within the confined chamber of his air pump, starting with attempts to detect the ether wind postulated by his adversaries, or to explain the cohesiveness of marble cylinders, or to suffocate small animals and put out candles. These experiments were later popularized by 18th century parlor physics. While a dozen civil wars were raging, Boyle chose a method of argument, that of opinion, that was held in contempt by the oldest scholastic tradition. Boyle and his colleagues abandoned the certainties of apodeictic reasoning in favor of a doxa. This doxa was not the raving imagination of the credulous masses, but a new mechanism for winning the support of one's peers. Instead of seeking to ground his work in logic, mathematics, or rhetoric, Boyle relied on a parajuridical metaphor. Credible, trustworthy, well-to-do witnesses gathered at the scene of the action can attest to the existence of a fact, the matter of fact, even if they do not know its true nature. So he invented the empirical style that we still use today. Boyle did not seek these gentlemen's opinion, but rather their observation of a phenomenon produced artificially in the closed and protected space of a laboratory. Ironically, the key question of the constructivists, are facts thoroughly constructed in the laboratory, is precisely the question that Boyle raised and resolved. Yes, the facts are indeed constructed in the new installation of the laboratory and through the artificial intermediary of the air pump. The level does descend in the Torricelli tube that has been inserted into the transparent enclosure of a pump operated by breathless technicians. Les faits sont faits, facts are fabricated, as Gaston Bachelard would say. But are facts that have been constructed by man artifactual for that reason? No. For Boyle, just like Hobbes, extends God's constructivism to man. God knows things because he creates them. We know the nature of the facts because we have developed them in circumstances that are under our complete control. Our weakness becomes a strength, provided that we limit knowledge to the instrumentalized nature of the facts and leave aside the interpretation of causes. Once again, Boyle turns a flaw. We produce only matters of fact that are created in laboratories and have only local value, into a decisive advantage. These facts will never be modified, whatever may happen elsewhere in theory, metaphysics, religion, politics, or logic. 2.3 Hobbes and his subjects. Hobbes rejected Boyle's entire theatre of proof. Like Boyle, Hobbes too wanted to bring an end to the Civil War. He too wanted to abandon free interpretation of the Bible on the part of clerics and the people alike. But he meant to reach his goal by a unification of the body politic, the sovereign created by the contract, that mortal God to which we owe, under the immortal God, our peace and defence, Hobbes 1651, is only the representative of the multitude. For it is the unity of the representer, not the unity of the represented, that maketh the person one. Hobbes was obsessed by the unity of the person, who is, as he puts it, the actor of which we citizens are the authors. It is because of this unity that there can be no transcendence. Civil wars will rage as long as there exist supernatural entities that citizens feel they have a right to petition when they are persecuted by the authorities of this lower world. The loyalty of the old medieval society to God and King is no longer possible if all people can petition God directly or designate their own king. Hobbes wanted to wipe the slate clean of all appeals to entities higher than civil authority. He wanted to rediscover Catholic unity, while at the same time closing off any access to divine transcendence. For Hobbes, power is knowledge, which amounts to saying that there can exist only one knowledge and only one power if civil wars are to be brought to an end. This is why the major portion of Leviathan is devoted to an exegesis of the Old and New Testaments. One of the great dangers for civil peace comes from the belief in immaterial bodies such as spirits, phantoms, or souls, to which people appeal against the judgments of civil power. Antigone might be dangerous when she proclaims the superiority of piety over Creon's reasons of state. The egalitarians, the levelers, and the diggers are much more so when they invoke the active powers of matter and the free interpretation of the Bible in order to disobey their legitimate princes. Inert and mechanical matter is as essential to civil peace as a purely symbolic interpretation of the Bible. In both cases, it behooves us to avoid at all costs the possibility that the factions may invoke a higher entity, nature or God, which the sovereign does not fully control. This reduction does not lead to a totalitarian state, since Hobbes applies it to the Republic itself. The sovereign is never anything but an actor designated by the social contract. There is no divine law or higher agency that the sovereign might invoke in order to act as he wishes and dismantle the Leviathan. In this new regime, in which knowledge equals power, everything is cut down to size: the sovereign, God, matter, and the multitude. Hobbes even rules out turning his own science of the state into an invocation of transcendence. He arrives at all his scientific results not by opinion, observation, or revelation, but by a mathematical demonstration, the only method of argument capable of compelling everyone's assent. And he accomplishes this demonstration not by making transcendental calculations, like Plato's king, but by using a purely computational instrument, the mechanical brain, a computer before its time. Even the famous social contract is only the sum of a calculation reached abruptly and simultaneously by all the terrorized citizens who were seeking to liberate themselves from the state of nature. Such is Hobbes's generalized constructivism designed to end civil war. No transcendence whatsoever, no recourse to God, or to active matter, or to power by divine right, or even to mathematical ideas. All the elements are now in place for the confrontation between Hobbes and Boyle. After Hobbes has reduced and reunified the body politic, along comes the Royal Society to divide everything up again. Some gentlemen proclaim the right to have an independent opinion in a closed space, the laboratory, over which the state has no control. And when these troublemakers find themselves in agreement, it is not on the basis of a mathematical demonstration that everyone would be compelled to accept, but on the basis of experiments observed by the deceptive senses, experiments that remain inexplicable and inconclusive. Worse still, this new coterie chooses to concentrate its work on an air pump that once again produces immaterial bodies. The vacuum, as if Hobbes had not had enough trouble getting rid of phantoms and spirits. And here we are again, Hobbes worries, right in the middle of a civil war. We are no longer to be subjected to the levelers and the diggers, who challenge the king's authority in the name of their personal interpretation of God and of the properties of matter. They have been properly exterminated. But we are going to have to put up with this new clique of scholars who are going to start challenging everyone's authority in the name of nature by invoking wholly fabricated laboratory events. If you allow experiments to produce their own matters of fact, and if these allow the vacuum to be infiltrated into the air pump and, from there, into natural philosophy, then you will divide authority again. The immaterial spirits will incite everyone to revolt by offering a court of appeal for frustrations. Knowledge and power will be separated once more. You will see double, as Hobbes put it. Such are the warnings he addresses to the king in denouncing the goings-on of the Royal Society.